Hello all, and this video is meant to actually now have an in-depth discussion with Husserl's not only concerns with naturalism, but his actual phenomenology, as we'll take a look at. And so if we were going to start where we left off in our last video and the method, now we want to see how his critique of naturalism is the launching pad for the method. And so, basically, the way we can look at naturalism through Husserl is his concern of the explanation of, every theory of the world, whether it's culturally or historically, has this sort of fixed principles that can only really be looked at through this empirical lens, which of course Husserl, respects to some degree. But he really sees, though, that psychology as the underlining way for how naturalism is observed through us. And so, if we want to go back, we would actually have to go, as he does, to what Descartes really saw as us as thinking things as compared to extension or these sort of principles out there. Of course, this would then lead to a relativistic way of looking at this thing, perhaps as Husserl does when he looks at someone like Delphi. If you remember, he looked at philosophy through different psychological worldviews. So, you have the rational, the ethical, and the empirical for him. Obviously this is going to lead to relativism because, none of these worldviews are actually the one true way of examining the sort of extension, since there is that duality there of difference. And so, Husserl's trying to find, the universal foundation for how all of those sort of temperaments are allowed to examine or be empirical. He wants to, place these sort of disciplines as they're, fragmenting out away from philosophy, you could say, actually, or the way Husserl wants to see philosophy, as we'll look at later. And so he wants to, get back to that foundationalism or the structures of the self and how we look at these sort of worldviews. And so if we were going to, be quick and concise here, the best way to, look at this critique is perhaps the way you look at the subject and object and how science operates under this sort of scheme or dichotomy through Descartes. This is the dominant way of thinking for science, where you isolate, an object and theorize about it, but you're not actually getting at your own subjectivity or the way in which those objects are going to be apprehended through the way you know or have knowledge of that object. This is quite an artificial way of looking at it, though, because to say I know is the activity of that subjective category, if we want to be Kantian about it, as he does. Those categories is how we are ultimately allowed to examine the object. And so this is a discourse, if you will, or a phenomenology of the hyphen between the subject and the object. That's sort of, difference in between there for how subjectivity in that process will give us way to look at these objects. And so if we were going to use Husserl's terminology here, this is what he would refer to as bracketing, or the suspension of judgment on objects of thought and perception. He also incorporates the Greek term epoche. So Husserl wants to ground the knowledge, or these pieces of knowledge out there, through these variables of particulars, to actually look at the essences of objects, because of course subjectivity is directed towards that objective of truth, and of course objectivity needs a sort of subjective process in order to be apprehended. And so he's trying to say the I know actually out there in human life, instead of theoretical presuppositions of descriptions of activity of the I in the life world, the I who is within the world, or that sort of pre-theoretical basis. And so we want to kind of park the brakes here for a second, because this is going to be important to look at how Sartre and Heidegger is going to want to look at being on that pre-theoretical basis. Because, there's the human life, pre-theory, before these suppositions or these disciplines are able to actually examine the world. So the naturalist, in part here with what Husserl is really getting at, is focus solely on that sort of objective scientific account of objects of reality, but it's leaving out the I, or that creativity, that transcendental ego. So in a way, this is the science of human consciousness, or the science of the I. You can't abstract the I or remove it from the world. And so you need to look at the hyphen between the subject and the object. So is he, taking Descartes and being more radical with the cogito, and how he looked at universal doubt. Husserl's not, doubting these things, but he's looking at what, the consciousness of, how the active I know about an object is. What does that actually look like? What are the principles? What are the essences of that? And so this leads, of course, to his main idea, and perhaps, more known than his critique of naturalism or the sciences, is his intentionality of consciousness. And so intentionality, to be brief, is the conscious external reference the mind has in knowing something, or the perception or knowledge that acts as a telos towards an object or activity of the mind. And so, the empiricist can't, look through practicality, at something like the activity of the mind, or how it actually works. You can't, go within that and, see that within the world, or look at it in that sort of way, or that representational view, or copies of the world, as, the 17th century thought of it. The way thinking actually is, just as it was for, the direction or the telos for the medievals. What is that thought actually like? And you don't actually apprehend everything. You don't actually apprehend ultimate reality, but you apprehend, something that you subjectively are taking in, and you create, through your subjectivity, how you see the object. But of course, it's done, in a directive way. It's not something to see empirically, but We all understand that this is how, we think in that sort of directional way, or that sort of way we, problem solve or philosophize in the world. And so, just like with memory, in that sort of temporal way, if you want to look at the tradition of that, which we will try to brush up on later, memory is referring back, something like that. And anticipation, as he call it, is, referring on to something in the future. So, there's a direction that these things go with the way we actually think through intentions. And so ideas is an activity, not just the sort of copies of the object. So he wants to take that sort of Kantian influence of the experience of form in that temporal way of how objects will be seen, because of course the way I see things is through my temporal activities of thought, which then leads to what Husserl will call the constitutive act. I constitute the act onto the object. There is no object without a subject, because I need to be there to constitute how it will be unified for me to perceive it. And so how can there be, that object without my subjective way of looking at it in that sort of temporal way? And so, how does this constitute the act of knowing for me, and the act of knowing I constitute the object as something for me? So, just like for Kant, the time form that schematizes the understanding and how it's pulled together. I think that adequately really gets to what he's saying with the constitutive act. And then he also goes on to referentiality, which is the act of meaning, and not just in this sort of existential way, but in the more way of referring onto how we will order those sort of objects in the world. So that sort of notion of the way we actually order our world, our life experience, in reference to. But of course there is meaning, not just in just what I mean, but in that sort of existential giving meaning to the world, of course, which is going to be something to always precursor to how this method will eventually be used with other European writers. And so ideas that I have about something, what he's trying to say is constitutive instead of that representational theory. And so Husserl, while he works on the method, he also does his own sort of phenomenology of time consciousness, which of course is really getting at that sort of essence of what Kant was doing with the way things are unified, which is of course getting at the foundations for some of his other works with regards to logical investigations and establishing how this method of phenomenology can be used for logic. And then I also wanted to in part say real fast on what he thinks philosophy should be, which I think is actually really interesting. He has that essay, or I think it's just an essay, but he wants to see philosophy as a way to establish the foundations to make a more rigorous science. And I think the way in which I described in some of my older videos with looking at the disciplines and how science kind of forms these theories that kind of seal themselves off into their own spaces. There's no real way of organizing anymore, or have a sort of placement of what Husserl would consider something like a dialogue on the essences. What are that sort of chain of actually getting to general, mature, abstract principles of reality as opposed to just particulars. And so there needs to be a foundational discipline, as I suggested. But of course, Husserl does so much better here, and sort of philosophy to establish that the need for the foundation in order for all the other disciplines to be set. Because of course, you can't have, if naturalism or there's sort of these fixed order of principles or an examination of the extension, if we're going to use that duality to its like real essence for what this discourse really is. Without the sort of foundations of understanding it, then mathematics, then anything we know about, knowledge about anything can't be objective, because we don't have that sort of universal, rigorous way of seeing that it's not relative to just worldviews that can't be objective, because of course the way we examine these objectives are through that Kantian ego. And so this is my video on Husserl's main ideas and concepts. I hope you guys enjoy it. Husserl was very fun to get into, and I think maybe when you look at something like his critique of naturalism, and seeing the way he obviously has a concern with how we're leaving out that sort of subjectiveness or creativity for how we look at the world, which ultimately, though, will lead to us not having an objective way to agree upon any of these truths. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and next time we'll get into Heidegger.